Welcome to the conversation with Ross Emmett. My name is Pavel Kuchar. Ross Emmett is a professor of economic thought at the Arizona State University, and today we're going to discuss Frank Knight, the distinction between risk and uncertainty, and the Chicago School of Economics.
I'd like to ask you, what was your personal motivation to look into that topic and to start studying Frank Knight?
Well, it's good. That's a very good entree. I actually come from, I now have, of course, been an economist for decades, but I came from a humanities-oriented background and was actually going to do a PhD in a totally different field. But I decided not to do that, and when I came back to thinking about what I wanted to do, this was myself when I was a senior in university, so when I was in my final year of university studies. And my parents pointed out to me that I probably needed some practical skills, so I enrolled in an international business master's program and received a master's degree in international business, or what today would be called an international MBA. And I actually lived and worked in Germany and worked at IBM headquarters in Germany for a little while. But throughout that process, realized that what I really wanted to do was look at the relationship between economics and religion, between religious thought and economic thought. And through a sort of interesting set of happenstances and circumstances, I ended up teaching business in a small liberal arts college. And everyone said, "You're going to make a wonderful professor. You need to get a PhD." And I said, yes, and I know what I want to do my PhD in, which is on economics and religious thought. And everybody went, "Well, that's weird. Nobody in economics knows anything about economics and religious thought." I went looking for people who might supervise a dissertation. It was very difficult to find anyone. What I did not know was at the same time that I was starting graduate school, there was a young scholar at the University of Chicago. His name is Larry Iannacone. And Larry Iannacone was writing a dissertation with one of the Chicago Nobels, Gary Becker. And in that dissertation, Larry was trying to convince Becker that he should take religious belief seriously as a variable in economic thinking. My approach was totally different. I was interested in the history of ideas. So I was interested in the emerging discussion between religious thought and economic thought, first in the 1700s and then beyond, about how we should govern society, about what responsibility the economic realm presented to us, both in terms of the possibility of prosperity, but also regarding our religious belief and religious activity. And so, but I couldn't find anybody to do a dissertation with. And finally, a couple people suggested that I contact Anthony Waterman, who was a professor at the University of Manitoba. I happened at that point then to have been living in Canada, so I could move to Manitoba, and I started working with Anthony Waterman. And Anthony asked, students will find this interesting because both it's sort of the happenstances of how you organize a career and also sort of what you're tasked with as you go into a PhD program. So Anthony Waterman asked me, he got a little bit of money together, and he said, I've been asked to write a survey article on economists writing on religion from Adam Smith to the present. And he said, I want you to accumulate the resources for me. So I spent a year working with him to accumulate a database of economists' writings in economic journals and books, etc., about economics and religion. And at that point in time, Anthony Waterman was writing about someone who I'm sure the students have studied, who is Robert Malthus. And Malthus's views. Malthus was an Anglican priest. He lifelong, his entire career, he was in the church. He was also the first professor of political economy at the East India College, which in fact was connected to his religious connections, because the people who ran the East India Company were also the people who were the basis for the Clapham sect, which is the group that opposed slavery under William Wilberforce and company. So Malthus was a good friend of the Wilberforces and those people. And so Anthony was writing a book on Malthus, and he said to me, "You're not a 18th or 19th century Englishman. You should write on something closer to home." And he said, "If you were to write about somebody other than the classical economists on religion and economics, who would you write on?" And I said, "Frank Knight." And I said, because Frank Knight poses the greatest challenge in the 20th century to the possibility of combining religious and economic thought.
That is a great story, Ross. It is, and I can see that there is also a lot of lines that are intersecting and then connecting, maybe a little bit in parallels with Frank Knight's own life and own genesis as a scholar. So I haven't really expected that, but I can use this as a bridge to ask you a little bit about the background of Frank Knight himself, because.
Yes.
For one, one of the parallels is that Knight also studied in Germany. He was
very briefly.
He was fluent with in German, and there is a question whether actually in Germany he met the late German historical school economist, who today is considered a sociologist, Max Weber. But that's maybe something we can talk about later. Could you tell us something about the early days of academic life of Frank Knight?
Yes. So Frank Knight grew up in rural Illinois, southern rural Illinois. And at the age of 12, his father took him out of school and told him that his school days were over. Actually, Frank Knight's brother, who was worth mentioning because he is also a famous economist, Melville Moses Knight, M.M. Knight, was a couple years younger than Frank, and he also was taken out of school at the age of 12. And so basically at the conclusion of what in America would be 8th grade. And the two brothers then worked for their father full-time on the farm, doing manual labor. And that essentially meant dragging a plow behind a horse. There's no mechanical farm implements on a small farm in rural Illinois. And they actually wrote a contract at some point with their father, the two brothers, and they had him sign it, agreeing that at the age of 18, they would be freed of their responsibilities with the farm and could go and pursue their own lives. And by the way, there's a third brother who also became an economist. Bruce Knight became a professor later on. He was younger. He became a professor at Dartmouth. So you actually have three brothers, economists, all. And Melville Moses Knight, by the way, M.M., he became a professor at Berkeley and taught Doug North. So he also taught Nobel Prize winners and has a reputation not exactly the same as his brother, but similar. But Frank, when he finished his obligations to his father, moved into the nearby city and lived with his mother's family for some period of time. We're not exactly sure, but he took high school courses during that year, and so he basically got what he could of a high school education that way, and then he proceeded to move and leave Illinois and his family, and he moved to rural Tennessee, And actually, just this past October, I visited each of the three institutions that he went to school at in Illinois over about a 5-year period. And he first went to a little college that we don't know exactly how he learned about it, though it was probably through the religious connections. And it was called American University. And it had dreams of being a national university. It never happened. The small college failed 2 years after Knight arrived. And Knight studied there, and basically, really what he got out of that college was the rest of his high school education, although he also learned German, and he also became the assistant to the president of the school. And this was a very important thing because Frederick Kirschner was a person who had a big role in a religious tradition called the Disciples of Christ. And Kirschner became, he was the president of this small school, American. He became the president of Milligan College, which still exists in eastern Tennessee. I visited there earlier this year. And also then the president of Texas Christian University, which is a well-known university in Texas today. And then he left there and moved to Butler University, and at Butler University founded the Divinity School there. And so Frederick Kirschner was an important figure in Knight's life. They remained friends throughout his life. Both of Frank Knight's brothers actually served also as assistants to Frederick Kirschner, but the impact of Kirschner on them is a little less than it is on Frank, because Frank spent so much of the early years with Kirschner, so Knight went to this small school, American University, then went to to Milligan College. Graduated. On the day he graduated, he married his first wife, and Minerva, and then they actually moved that summer to the University of Tennessee. And at the University of Tennessee, he proceeded. He was enrolled not as a graduate student because they weren't certain that his undergraduate background at Milligan was sufficient for him to be a graduate student, but they enrolled him as a student, an advanced student in the sciences, looking probably towards a career in chemistry and or physics. He proceeded to, at the end of that first year during the summer, he radically changed course. And when he returned to Tennessee, he told them that he did not want to complete a bachelor's degree in the sciences. He instead wanted to proceed towards doing a PhD in philosophy. And so they cobbled together a program that would allow him to graduate. And he focused on languages. He was already fluent in French and partly in German. He wrote a master's degree actually at Tennessee in German on the work of a recent Nobel Prize winner who was a German literary figure, Gerhard Hauptmann. And Knight finished at Tennessee with both an undergraduate degree in the sciences and a graduate degree a master's degree in German literature.
Was he interested in linguistics at all, or was he interested in languages, history of?
I'm assuming he had a fair facility for languages because we know that he was fluent in German. He had a reading knowledge of French, and he also had a reading knowledge of Italian. Right. Probably not as good as his French. Right. And so the study of language was not does not particularly seem to be of interest to him, but the language acquisition and language proved very useful to him,
Right.
both in his research when he got to Cornell and also throughout his life. He then proceeded to go to Cornell. Before he went to Cornell, he traveled during the summer of 1913. The summer of 1914 would have been a less auspicious, a less beneficial time to travel to Central Europe, because World War I was breaking out.
Right.
But a year before World War I, Frank Knight spent over a month in Germany. He traveled to several places. I'm almost 100% certain he went through Heidelberg, although I do not believe he ever met Max Weber. We don't have any proof that he ever met Weber, although there were suggestions he might have. He certainly became acquainted with Weber's work through his German language skills. And he went to Marburg, and at Marburg he listened to a series of lectures by a theologian, again the theology theme. Actually, the theologian, I've forgotten his name at the moment, but this theologian is the guy who was the mentor to both Karl Barth and to Rudolf Bultmann, two of the great B's of German theology in the post-war period, and or interwar 20th century anyway, but then Knight returned to the U.S. And went just in time to go to Cornell and start classes at Cornell. By the way, his wife did not accompany him to Europe. Frank Knight's father provided enough money for him to go and not for her. So she stayed home with her family. Family dynamics are always an interesting part of every story, and don't forget it. I'm sure for the students listening to this, they have their own stories of drama.
Yeah.
So, but Knight then proceeded to start a philosophy PhD at Cornell, and sometime during the spring semester of his first year was informed by the head of the philosophy department that they did not want to pursue having him as a student because the story goes because he was too skeptical for philosophy, right? Which of course everyone in economics thinks is fantastic, and all the philosophers roll their eyes. And actually, that relationship ended on good terms. One of the professors he had in philosophy, he took another course with. The guy served on his dissertation committee, so there wasn't like some big huge break between his philosophical studies and economics. But he moved over. They just recommended him, nudged him into doing something more practical, more up his line. Yes, right. It was in that context that he started working with Alvin Johnson, who was a recently arrived professor at Cornell. And that's where we really start the story about risk, uncertainty, and profit, because Johnson was an American theorist. And by that I mean, ironically, that the economists before him at Cornell had required students to read across multiple languages. And Johnson only had the students read American economic thought, not German, Italian, French economic thought. And in particular, the work of John Bates Clark. And Alvin Johnson himself was part of what Frank Knight called the Clark School, the John Bates Clark School. By the way, for students, there's two Clarks in economics, so you have to distinguish them. There's J.B. Clark, that's John Bates Clark. He wrote a very famous book called The Distribution of Wealth, which provided essentially the idea that your wage would equal, in a perfectly competitive market context, your wage would equal the marginal value that your labor contributed to the firm's revenue. So the marginal value product argument, that's John Bates Clark argument. But he provided it, he took that and created it as an ethical justification for wages. And part of Knight's interest in the Clark tradition is this mix of economic theory and ethics, and Clark's defense of capitalism on the grounds that people were being paid the marginal, their contribution to value at the margin. And so Alvin Johnson was part of the Clark school, but Johnson said to Frank Knight, we don't have a good enough account of profit yet. So why don't you pick up the hardest task, the task of thinking about profit out of this tradition? And so that's the task that Knight took up in his dissertation.
That is a long struggle, right? Accounting for where profit comes from. It really goes back to thinkers like Cantillon.
Well, I was going to say well before Smith. Yes.
Like Cantillon, like Smith wrestles with it. Turgot has a slightly different
Right.
theory. Karl Marx, of course, has the famous exploitation theory, right? And until late in the 19th century, you can still see that there is not really an agreement. How can we justify profit? Where does it come from, and how much it should be? Who should get it, and why?
And one can argue that we still struggle with justifying it, especially with what one might call superordinary profits. In fact, some of Frank Knight's students or people who inherited his tradition have tried to provide economic explanations for extraordinary profits. The theme of profit is always an ongoing discussion in the history of economics, in part because perfect competition theory suggests that profits were there to be perfect competition, that profits would be competed down to sort of the lowest amount possible to keep you in the business. And of course, we see around us people making lots of profit. Of course, we also forget that there's lots of people making no profit, and hence leaving businesses, which is something that Frank Knight was well aware of. So Knight picked up that theme. He wrote a dissertation that was actually called A Theory of Business Profit. The dissertation, he then spent and he wrote that the second year he was in graduate school, and he wrote it in great haste. In fact, I've just been rereading it, and it's clearly written as quickly as possible. He then he was awarded his dissertation, awarded a PhD, and he stayed at Cornell for another year to continue working on his book, now the dissertation turning into a book. There was at that time a famous essay competition that one of the men's clothing companies ran, and it was an essay competition for economic essays. If you can believe it, businesses actually promoted people reading economic thought in the popular press. And the company is called Hart, Schaffner and Marx. You may actually know the company because their logo, HSM, is still used today. It's owned by a leading American clothier, and it's still used on high-quality men's clothing. Not the highest quality, but high-quality men's clothing, HSM. And so the company is still in existence, although it's been sold. And it's really the brand that is still in existence, and the company itself has been sold and resold. But this essay competition, he ended up winning second prize, and not first prize, second prize. The person who won first prize won it for a very American institutional dissertation. The essay was on the electrification of Massachusetts. And it was a study of how Massachusetts had become electrified. And this is a very typical American institutionalist kind of research project.
Was there any economic theory in it?
Probably not. And in fact, the essay and the book that was published shortly thereafter, more shortly than Frank Knight's was, the book that was published has never been cited, and except until the article that I just am publishing that cites it. So its first citation will be in an essay about Frank Knight, not about the guy's own work. However, he probably had a wealthier career than Knight because he went on to become an executive in the DuPont company and was a top-level executive in DuPont chemical company. So he probably did quite well for himself. Meanwhile, Frank Knight won second prize and then spent a couple years bouncing around academic life as other people do. He went to the University of Chicago, where he was going to end up. He went to the University of Chicago as a 2-year replacement for Jacob Viner, who became one of his best friends, teaching statistics and economics.
Which year was that?
And that was 1917 to 1919.
Was Veblen around, or is that too late? That is too late for Veblen, right?
That's too late for Veblen. However, during those 2 years, Frank Knight joined several other people in a reading group on Veblen's work. Mm. And that's where he met his lifelong frenemy, an English American word, friend/enemy, Clarence Ayers, who is one of the famous American institutionalists. And Ayers and Knight were both at Chicago in that period, 1917 to 1919. Ayers was doing a PhD in philosophy, and Knight was in economics, teaching economics. And also Harold Innis, who was the most famous Canadian economist of the early part of Canadian economic thought. Harold Innis was also a student at Chicago, a grad student at Chicago in economic history in that same period of time, doing work, beginning the work that he did on the Canadian Railway. And
so Knight would keep bouncing into institutionalist everywhere after losing to an institutionalist in that essay contest. He comes to Chicago, and there is another bunch of them.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and he continues because he then takes a position at Iowa, and so he ends up taking a permanent position at Iowa and teaching economics at the University of Iowa. And it's while he's at Iowa, so he was in Iowa between 1919 and 1928, essentially, so about 9 years. He became a full professor. He taught economic theory. By the way, this is almost entirely undergraduate students. This is not, I don't know that Iowa at that point in time had a graduate program in economics. One of his famous students is Chamberlain, Edward Chamberlain, and it was actually a footnote in Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit that led Chamberlain to write his book on the theory of monopolistic competition, which is supposed to be a theory in between perfect competition theory and monopoly theory. And Knight says in a footnote something to the effect of, why do we only have a theory of perfect competition or monopoly? And he said, I'm interested in imperfect competition, the world in between these two, imperfect competition. And he uses uncertainty theory to get to that. And Chamberlain instead takes a institutional kind of approach to the nature of the market and the structure of the market, and uses that as the foundation for his economics of the firm. And Chamberlain ends up at Harvard, which is where Knight almost ended up at in the 30s as well. But Knight decided to stay. Once he had gone to Chicago, he decided to stay at the University of Chicago again when he was invited back. He was invited. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, excuse me. I think it shows, it tells you something about the prominence of institutionalism, and also I suppose many of the people who were teachers to Knight or his colleagues must have been educated by the German professors in Europe, and so the influence both of the German historical school and institutionalism in the environment where Knight would grow up and professionalize as an academic must have been quite strong.
I'm having a mixed reaction to that question. Let me see if I can flesh it out. Let's go back to Cornell for a moment. Alvin Johnson replaced Frank Fetter. Frank Fetter taught economic theory at Cornell for quite a number of years, and Fetter's syllabus was full of multiple languages and multiple schools of thought. Alvin Johnson actually told his students at the beginning of the semester that he had been hired to teach Fetter's course, but that he had no interest in any economics other than American economics, and that he didn't care if they read the French and German. Fetter had assignments where the students had to read in German, some of the work of the German historical school.
And Fetter was educated in Germany, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And Johnson was not. He was educated at Columbia. So it's interesting because Knight, in some ways, Knight sits at odds with the people he's actually being taught by and is more in the tradition of the people who came before them. He had wanted to do his PhD in Germany. It's fortunate for him that he didn't, because he would have been caught in the middle of World War I. But he ended up in the U.S. He maintained his fluency in German. He also was fluent in French, and perhaps even more fluent in French early on than he was in German. And then he also learned some Italian when he spent a couple months in Italy. And of course, the Italian connection is carried on in Frank Knight's not student / mentee, Jim Buchanan, who gained a very excellent reading knowledge in Italian because of his desire to understand the Italian public finance school. And if you don't know anything about the Italian public finance school and you're interested in public finance, that's a good approach to go look at. And Knight knew many of those people as well, although he focused more in German literature. Basically, while he was at the University of Iowa, he realized, this is what he said. He said, "I'm not going to be an economic theorist. I'm just not good enough to be an economic theorist. What I can do is study institutionalism." So when he was hired at Chicago from Iowa in 1928, he was hired to teach economic history and institutionalism. And his goal was to create a new institutionalism, an institutionalism that did not lack the theoretical orientation that American institutionalism lacked.
That's quite interesting. This is something that took about 50 years, based on what you're saying. And Ronald Coase was really making the same point, saying that the old institutionalists had a lot of empirical data
but no theory to use it,
and no theory framework to put it in.
Yeah.
So it is quite interesting that this kind of a theoretical underpinning of institutionalism resides within Frank Knight.
Here, Frank Knight is studying at Cornell with a student of John Bates Clark, and the student Alvin Johnson says to him, "There's this hole in economic theory, and it's the theory of profit." And Knight picks this up. And at the time, there was a body of literature which emphasized profit as the result of risk. But it was the risk of it was kind of an emerging discussion, because everyone realized that there are risks that we can quantify, that we can say, oh, there's a 20% probability that this building is going to burn down because of the materials it's built from, let's say. So everyone realized that there were quantifiable risks that were objectively known, right? And but in the literature, they wanted to use the word risk in a wider way. They wanted to use it to denote some of the ways that we use risks, like saying things like, well, it would be risky, to do X, without necessarily thinking about it in a quantifiable sense, but in some kind of dynamic sense. And it was into that literature that Frank Knight stepped with his doctoral dissertation. And he distinguishes in the dissertation, so remember the dissertation was called A Theory of Business Profit. The book is entitled Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. In the dissertation, the theme of uncertainty is distinguished from the theme of risk. So you have risk and you have uncertainty. And the uncertainty is in a sense, it's the unquantifiable.
I think that's what we can see here when he talks about these business decisions, for example, that deal with situations, as you said, which are far too unique, generally speaking, for any sort of statistical tabulation to have any value for guidance, right? The conception of any objectively measurable probability or chance doesn't apply. And then he continues talking about these two types of risk or uncertainty, or which there is this type of uncertainty which he says has been really neglected in economic theory. And that is the kind of risk that, or uncertainty that by any method cannot be reduced to an objective, quantifiably determinate probability, right? So if we have risk that we can group into cases, then he says, well, we have insurance companies. The business world can basically group these cases based on the appropriate categories, and we simply discount our fixed costs. We know that every year a number of houses will burn. We don't know which particular house it will be, but we know that there will be a particular percentage because of a failure of materials, etc. And there is really nothing uncertain about that, Knight would say. But then this is the last paragraph, really, from that chapter 7. That there is this much more important task to follow out on the consequences of the higher form of uncertainty, which is not susceptible to measurement, and we can't really get rid of it or eliminate it. And that's the true uncertainty, right? The Knightian uncertainty that some people call it, which by preventing the theoretically perfect outworking of the tendencies of competition gives the characteristic form of enterprise to economic organization as a whole and accounts for the peculiar income of the entrepreneur. So I think in this last sentence, really, we have a distinction between two kinds of risk, one which can't really be eliminated, impossible to measure or predict, and that gives rise to profit, and that also requires some kind of an entrepreneur to exercise judgment in those situations. And I think this is the famous contribution that Knight makes here in this book. Why is he making it? It's there has to be more than just accounting for profit, right? He might have some methodological plans with it as well.
I'll make a couple comments, because it's nice that you stopped at this point and didn't continue on, because up to this point, this is the point at which the actual doctoral dissertation ends.
Right.
So the manuscript that he submitted for his doctoral dissertation only gets us as far as this idea that there is this uncalculable form of uncertainty that can't therefore be eliminated by some scientific process, and that that is distinguishable from risk, but which accounts for the entrepreneur.
Yeah.
And I often think that he's thinking back to actually the year after he worked on the farm, when he was engaged in high school activity. The uncle who he was helping, and he was doing work for an uncle, The uncle, by the way, was only like 7 years older than Knight. So this was the much younger brother of his mother,
Right.
that he was working with. The uncle was starting a telephone company,
Right.
and was dealing with competition in the town, and dealing with the risks and uncertainties of starting a business, having to make decisions that you don't necessarily know the consequences of,
Right.
but which everything depends upon.
Yeah.
Right. And Knight was working with this, and actually ran the switchboard for the telephone company at night, to be able to make little money. It is said that there was a massive storm one winter evening in Lexington, Illinois, the town that Knight was living in, and that his uncle, lived in and ran a telephone company for. There was a massive storm one night, and all the competitors' telephone lines went down except for Frank Knight's brother's lines. It is said that happened, and that the brother succeeded because of the mysterious results of the very bad thunderstorm that happened. I have a picture of Frank Knight and his uncle out there ripping down the competition's lines, but maybe it didn't happen that way. Maybe it happened by chance, by the unpredictable chances.
Right.
But anyway, it was in that kind of context, I think, that Knight saw for the first time the kinds of things that he was thinking about. And notice most of the economists who were writing in the institutional tradition were thinking about big institutions. They were thinking about emerging big firms. I'll say this to the students. It's many students, when they think of business, they think of Google, Amazon. You can supply the company names from the UK. And whereas Frank Knight's always thinking about the little startup firm, the small company that is getting started, has a much smaller footprint, doesn't have the kind of means and resources that large corporations have. Indeed, the kind of businesses which have fueled market societies from the very earliest times. There's almost nothing as risky or as uncertain, to use Knight's term, as taking your goods to market in a wheelbarrow, that you have to go 5 or 10 miles to the next town to sell your goods, not knowing what competition will be there or who else will be there, back in the 14th and 15th century.
That is exactly the story, the example that you find in Cantillon, right? That you have this middleman who goes to the countryside and buying for fixed price and just exercising judgment that the price in the city market is going to be higher. Today, as we sit here, we don't even know how the traditional delivery of lectures at universities is going to look like, not in 10 years, but in 6 months or in 1 year. How practical laboratory work is going to look like at universities. So that radical uncertainty doesn't necessarily have to run through, or Knightian or true uncertainty doesn't necessarily have to run through 5 or 10 years. It could be something quite present, and I think many of us experience this unease, or I think Knight even talks about repugnance, about a month or 2 months ago, where we didn't know what is this cataclysm that we're actually dealing with, and who does it hit, and whether we can be immune to it, and should we shut down or should we not shut down. And there are these costs that you will incur, but you don't really have any cost-benefit calculus, because there is simply that future which is unknown. And I think in that sense, Knight really becomes much more present. The extended present, as Balding talks about, it brings Knight much closer to us.
Right.
So I have a couple of quotes here that I wanted to show and identify what is it that
Right.
he talks
Okay.
about. So earlier on, I started from the end of the 7th chapter where he speaks about the business decision and introduces that distinction. And he talks about that throughout the essay when he distinguishes between the theoretical difference between a probability connected with an estimate and that involved in such phenomena that are dealt with by an insurance. So the estimate, that is really something, what is going to happen in 20 years? We're in the 90s. Can I watch TV on a phone? No one would even think about it. So, however, you cannot really insure yourself against the future, which is unknown. You can insure yourself against your house burning down, for instance. And that is that important distinction that Knight is making. Right, and when he speaks about this manufacturer who is considering whether it's advisable to make a large commitment, he figures. He doesn't bring out the calculator and calculates the profits and then losses 10 years hence. He figures. He makes a judgment, more or less on the proposition, taking account as well as possible of the various factors that are more or less susceptible of measurement. But the final result would Knight point out that the final result is an estimate of the probable outcome of any proposed course of action, right? So I think there are these important distinctions that Knight is making. And I wanted to ask you here about this point, because this is a point that Knight is making in 1921, and when he writes his dissertation and turns it into a published book. And we know that around that time, Keynes writes a treatise on probability. But when we look 15 years in the future from Keynes's perspective in 1936, and look at the general theory, we will find something that I actually think sounds remarkably similar. And I have some of the quotes from Keynes's 1937 paper, which is in the Quarterly Journal, and this comes from the chapter 12 of the general theory, where Keynes says, our knowledge of the factors which will govern the yield of an investment some years hence is usually very slight. We don't know much about it. And if we speak frankly, we have to admit that our basis of knowledge for estimating the yield 10 years hence of a railway or copper mine, a textile factory, goodwill of a patent medicine, Atlantic liner, they are not very good. Building in a city of London, not even 10 or 5 years hence. If we look at the paper where he explains himself to his critics in 1937, he defends himself, and he basically makes the clear point, Keynes makes the clear point, that his book is primarily about this uncertainty. And he explains that by uncertain knowledge, he doesn't mean just what is known for certain for what is only probable. And then he says, well, roulette is risky, it is not uncertain, the prospect of a victory bond, even the weather is moderately uncertain, not uncertain in a true sense of the word. And the sense in which he is using the term is that in which a prospect of a European war is uncertain, or the price of copper, or the rate of interest 20 years hence, or the obsolescence of a new invention. Right? When we learned about Uber, or when we learned about Airbnb, we didn't know how to classify or categorize these new ventures. Is it a hotel, or is it couch surfing? Is it a taxi, or am I just giving rides to friends? So these new inventions usually introduce these new categories. And if we look, Keynes says in his time, 40 years in the future, we have no scientific basis on which to form any calculable probability, whatever. We simply do not know. And that, to me, when I look at it, that seems to me that 15 years after Knight publishes Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, Keynes is writing about the same idea that Knight wrote 15 years before that. And I wonder, what are your thoughts about the similarities and differences between those two?
Well, on this basis, I think they are quite similar. I think where they end up So I don't have any trouble suggesting that the kind of argument Keynes is making here is very similar to the kind of argument about uncertainty that Frank Knight makes initially in his doctoral dissertation, and then that appears, you said, by the end of chapter 7, right, it's about there, of risk, uncertainty, and profit. There's more in risk, uncertainty, and profit to the idea of uncertainty than this. And so the question about judgment is not just about investments. So there's some issues about judgment, which Knight includes, which Keynes doesn't have. But certainly Keynes's response is very similar to Knight's in terms of thinking about the problem of the world. We can't do this all by math. There has to be some kind of, if you wish, intuitive feel, judgment, intuition. The person who is the owner of the railway, the person who is the owner of the business has to, and especially notice here we're connecting ownership and control. So the word entrepreneur is appropriate in Knight because it's an owner who's also operating the firm, as opposed to the corporation where the owners are paid and the managers run the firm. And so both men see this problem, and I agree that the vision is quite similar. Knight attacks, of course, Keynes's book, but on different grounds. For the theory of capital, mostly, some other things, and the two men came from very, very different worlds, and it would have been hard for the two of them to fundamentally connect in some way. But that conception of the sort of inability to use math to get us all the way to the end of the problem.
And that underlined the writing of the both of them, right? They are coming from different background. You told this really remarkable story of work ethic, of the strong influence of faith and religion on Knight, and if you look at Keynes's history, it's the absolute,
quite different.
It's the absolute opposite of everything.
Yes, exactly.
That you said about the farm boy from living in southern United States, and they have different, you could say, ideological outlooks, and they also, I think, draw different conclusions from the problem that. The decision-making is not always or purely based on this rational economic calculus, and that there are really limits to perfect information. But I think it is remarkable that more than one point, I think, that both of them agree on the same phenomenon, that there is this same problem and there is this same phenomenon which drives decision-making in the world, which is changing. I think when Knight talks about judgment and well-informed estimates, I think Keynes talks about animal spirits, but then he also says there is this propensity to do something, right? We have to do something positive.
Right.
And then Keynes even introduces some of the ideas of, well, what's going to be the basis on which we're going to do something? And he says, there are some things, we have some heuristics, right? We can use rules of thumb. We can project and expect that the future is going to be like present. Or we can just basically follow and look what other people do. And I think even there, sort of expecting that the future is going to look much like the present, that is something that Knight also mentions, right? He says, well, as long as we can sort of believe that we know what's going on, right? That we understand the situation, that we understand the world, then we can just project that knowledge in the future and act in an intelligent or competitive way. The problem is when we actually do not notice that the world is changing. And I think they both would agree that this is a problem, but I think they would also draw really quite different conclusions from that,
Right.
from that problem.
Absolutely.
So it is remarkable to me that there is this connection between these two authors, which really runs through that span of 1.5 decades. But also, I think it is quite interesting, and you mentioned that when Knight writes a book review on the report on the general theory, he doesn't talk at all about uncertainty in Keynes. He doesn't mention it. And it could be that he agrees with it, or it could be that he's not interested at that point in it at all, that he just simply would let it go in 1937.
The latter is definitely the case. We've mentioned Weber and the work of Max Weber, and I actually think that in the late 1920s, as Knight struggled to understand the German historical school and American institutionalism, was trying to figure out what the heck these people were thinking, that he encountered the work of Weber. Whether he had encountered Weber's work before or not, he encountered the work of Weber and became quite interested in it. And even though he did not continue working on Weber's work after he translated Weber into English, he gained a very Weberian perspective. And that Weberian perspective gave him a way of thinking about economics that was really quite different than the trajectory that risk, uncertainty, and profit was taking him along. And so the theory of risk, uncertainty, and profit is you start with the world of perfect competition, and then you relax the assumptions to come closer and closer to reality. And the thing that was interesting about risk, uncertainty, and profit is that Knight says the most important assumption that economic theory makes is the assumption of perfect knowledge. And if we just relax it a little bit, calculable probabilities, right? So this world of calculation, perfect knowledge, or calculable knowledge, he says that's the first thing we have to get rid of. And if we're going to move from the world of perfect competition to the world of real competition. And it's the first one we have to get rid of because it's the most important difference between the world we occupy and the world of economic theory. And so in risk, uncertainty, and profit, he's following this line of successive approximation towards reality. But when he encounters Weber's work, he finds a totally different framework for thinking about the work of theory and the work of the world and the study of the world around him. And that's the application of ideal type analysis with real historical situational study. And so in a weird way, Frank Knight's work, and this is one of the things that frustrates people about Frank Knight, and I quite understand it because it is frustrating. He stops going farther. He stops going farther towards relaxing the assumptions to the real world.
Yeah.
Edward Chamberlain, who was a student in Iowa, must have been flabbergasted when he, encountered Chicago economists of like Stiegler, who was Frank Knight's student, because he was following Frank Knight's lead from risk, uncertainty, and profit in this relaxing assumptions, creating monopolistic competition or imperfect competition. I can never remember whether he or Joan Robinson had which word, but the notion of sort of moving towards the real world, and Knight instead goes the other direction. Purify theory, make it as abstract as possible. The theory of capital, for example, that he develops in the 30s as a response to the Austrians and also to Keynes, is way more theoretical, abstract, timeless, outside of perfect competition, or into perfect competition than the world that the other theorists are thinking about engaging. And And Frank Knight says we need an understanding of the mechanisms of the market,
which are universal, which
are universal,
which run through time and are changeable, regardless if you are in ancient Egypt or at Wall Street.
Yeah, and that economic theory has given us. So there's some work to do to purify it still a little bit, but that's pretty much there.
I think there is a couple of really interesting points that you're making, and that I'd like to mention and point out. You mentioned the methodological process of successive approximation, and it is interesting that there is a lot of influence of the English political economists, certainly Marshall, and that successive approximation is something that John Stuart Mill proposes in terms of we're going to define the Homo economicus, and we know that Homo economicus is absolutely unrealistic. And even in John Stuart Mill, and we discussed that with Geoffrey Hodgson, you will find in John Stuart Mill this expectations that as we develop the ethnography, as we will develop our capacity to learn about different cultures, the universalism of our economic theory is probably going to be shrinking more and more. And Geoffrey Hodgson actually appropriates Knight, and he calls him.
He likes him,
to be an institutionalist.
Institutionalist, yes, he does.
And I did ask him about that, and then Geoffrey Hodgson says, "Well, I have a definition of institutionalism that whenever anyone is interested in institutions, then they're institutionalists." and I think that is one thing which is also quite confusing, because you also mentioned that there is skepticism towards institutionalism in the early Knight. He is critical towards Veblen, he is critical towards many of his institutionalist colleagues, and yet he himself gradually becomes an institutionalist. But at the same time, he is essentially the person who ends the debate about how do we define neoclassical theory. Right? He's the person who basically establishes the model of the perfect competition and sort of the universal economic theory, but then also points out that we can explain very little with it. It is universal, but it is also not very useful in most of the cases. Because
what he says is that we need two other things.
Right.
So leaving the 20s, leaving even the 30s to a certain extent, but by the end of the 30s, he says we need two other things. To do social science, to understand society, we need two other things. We need an ethic. So we need a theory of ethics. And we need a theory of politics or social organization, or society and politics.
Yeah.
And so he says we don't need to expand economics to be the science of all society.
Which is really quite interesting when you mentioned Larry Annacone in connection with Gary Becker. But let's leave that for a little bit later.
No,
go ahead.
Yeah. So Knight goes the opposite direction. He says, and he actually from the mid 1940s on, he spends his life trying to write a book which will have essentially three components: economic organization, ethics, and social political organization. And he says you need these three things. In a weird way, in America today, there's a growing interest in what are called philosophy, politics, and economics programs, PPE programs.
Right.
In a weird way, Knight is the origin of those.
Proto PPE in America, in the United States.
Right. It's because he wants philosophy.
Yeah.
Politics in the old understanding of the word politics, not the new politics. Political science today is the application of economic methods to political problems.
There's this democracy by discussion theme in Knight, right?
That's definitely part of what we could point to for that, and along with some other things. And then we have the ethical. So and he believes that the social theorist needs to have an ethics. Now, of course, of the three fields, PPE, philosophy being ethics, he was never satisfied with any theory of ethics he ever met. He was never satisfied with any definition of politics that he ever met, other than the notion that democracy is government by discussion. And he took economics, so economics he had. The other two he could never be satisfied with. And he never finished the book. There's multiple versions of a book which he never finished. But that he gave many lectures on, that are the sort of these three parts that are needed together to be able to address the problems of the world. The best place where they come out is in the book that Jim Buchanan had published, which is a set of recorded essays at the University of Virginia by Knight, entitled "Intelligence and Democratic Action,"
right?
Which is one version of Knight's argument, but it was only one.
There is a couple of more things when we can I think look into the writing of the early Frank Knight, who still believes there is some sense in working on true or uncertainty, which is distinguished from risk, and I have still pointed out to some of these quotations from the 7th chapter. That's all that we're reading today, really, where he talks that we're living in the world of change, and that's the world of uncertainty, and we know something about it, but we know very little about it. So it's not that the case that we do not know anything. And it is interesting here that he, when he defines really the economic theory, he talks about this dogma, which really, that's sort of the definition of sometimes caricatured today. And he himself even mocks it, which is the presupposition of perfect knowledge, that the world is made up of things which under the same circumstances always behave in the same way, right? So that's the sort of classification, categorization of things that doesn't change. And in that world, we can navigate, we can calculate, we can act reasonably, we can even appear rational in some sense. And he continues in explaining that, well, it must be possible not merely to assume that the same thing will always behave in the same way, but the same kind of thing will do the same thing, and that there is, in fact, a finite, practically manageable number of kinds of things. Hence, the fundamental role of classification has always played in thought and the theory of thought. And I think, really, this is, to me, that sounds quite understudied, but very ripe for discussion, the importance of classification. And when we talk about these new institutionalists, right, Douglas North talks about mental models in the 90s, and how do we categorize, classify things? How do you categorize Airbnb, right? Is it a hotel, or is it just friends providing services on a voluntary basis, sharing couches? That is really important for your capacity to calculate, but also to legislate, to regulate, to establish where do markets come from and what makes market legitimate. Maybe there is some kind of an implication that in that world where everything is classified in a way which doesn't change, in that world where we have perfect knowledge, that world of perfect competition, which is the world without profit, maybe the freedom of the will disappears in that world, right? And if we continue reading here, I think this is a really interesting paragraph. So if there is real indeterminateness, and if the ultimate seat of it is in the activities of the human machine, there is, in a sense, an opening of the door to a conception of freedom in conduct. We feel justified in further contending for at least the possibility that mind may in some inscrutable way originate action. And I think there has been some follow-up, even maybe in some people who would follow Keynes in the second half of the 20th century.
Yes.
When I read this part, it sounds to me that might be something that G.L.S. Shackle, for instance, might agree with profoundly. But I think Keynes wasn't that much interested with the connection of this uncertainty with freedom. So
Right.
is it important that Knight in this sense go beyond Keynes, and why would it be important in your opinion?
So I had not spotted, I've read this of course before, but I had not spotted it again recently, and so thank you for bringing it back to my attention. It's a very interesting place in the book. And I'll make a comment. His first wife actually ended up writing her dissertation on the freedom of the will, in a philosophy department with an analytical philosopher, nonetheless. And she was challenged on this very concept of freedom of the will. But I certainly think that Knight kept this throughout his life, and this is part of his. So it links for him to in some ways the desire to not pin down economic rationality to as airtight a version as say the tradition coming out of his friend Lionel Robbins does. When Robbins wrote his book and on the nature and significance of economics, and argued that we should not talk about values, we should only talk about actions. Frank Knight wrote him in a letter and said, "What do you mean we can't talk about values? There's nothing else that we'd rather talk about than
And that
values."
is also something that survived in a sort of a pathological way in the De Gustibus Non Est Disputandum. We don't speak about values and preferences. And it might be, it almost seems to me that someone must have misheard Knight during his lectures. Like you have a student who sleeps throughout all the lecture, and Knight says, "We must not talk about values," and the student doesn't hear the "we must not." Only remembers the "we don't talk about values." It almost seems to be as a kind of a happening historically.
But if your goal is to make economics as scientific as possible, we can't talk about value. Value is, I just have to ask you, what do you value? So then the Stiegler-Becker line that you're referring to, the De Gustibus Non Est Disputandum assumption, becomes really relevant because now Chicago economics says, I don't even have to know anything about what you value, and so I don't have to know your utility function. I can assume from your reaction to price changes that how you're going to respond.
It's this kind of a positivist or objective take on what we observe. We don't have to really bother with understanding how people understand their world, their reality, how they relate to it. And it seems to me when I listen to you talking about it, that in the project of the late Knight, that was interested in the theory of economics in terms of neoclassical economics, ideal types, perfect competition, perfect knowledge, very
plus institutions
and ethics,
the next category, and ethics,
political organization, institutions. So we're basically combining this very sort of radically almost subjectivist understanding of people and valuation and this sort of normative moral. And it seems that in Knight's case, even religious dimension with that kind of an instrumental, rigorous, but also very, very tight but limited price theory, which that really I think goes back to Marshall and then connects the modern or new Chicago School of Economics with the old English political economics. But it seems to me that when I listen to you, that some of the elements of the research and thinking about uncertainty, true uncertainty, have survived throughout in the late Frank Knight, and it has to do with the freedom of choice and the freedom
Right.
of will and the necessity to understand, classify the situation, and put your just place the bet, make the choice, right?
And you also get it. He maintains throughout his life, and it pops up in his writings occasionally, the theme that is actually from his Iowa years for sure, and that is that what people want is not more wants, but they want better wants.
Right.
Or not, people don't just want to satisfy their wants; they want more wants, but they want better wants. And so whether you call that an ethical stance or a aesthetic stance, he writes an essay on beauty which expresses this. So however you place it in that world, it's a world which says human beings are always unsettled, always. There's a questing component to human life that is always looking for something better, and our consumption activities are a way of exploring that. So yes, we maximize, and yet we might include in our maximization, since everybody's ordering things from restaurants to come to their house, you might order a different thing to come just to have some variety and see if maybe something might be better than your current choices.
It absolutely doesn't sound like a hedonistic theory. It sounds like a theory of learning and exploration,
right.
bettering yourself, let's say ethically and epistemologically in a sense.
No, that's very much the case.
And that can, to some extent, make some space for this rational, calculated economic man or economic agent that has perfect knowledge, but that's very limited. And you also have this kind of homo heuristic, or just this kind of a person that acts, Keynes would say, on animal spirits, on urges, on these impulses, sort of groping in the dark. Like maybe in the case of the telephone company, you simply experiment, you try, you learn, and you get the feedback from the world around you. And it is a major project. It seems like it's a synthesis that around that time everybody talks about the neoclassical synthesis, which happens sort of in parallel. It seems that the synthesis that Knight is interested in is more of a synthesis of the neoclassical economics with the institutionalism, with the historical school, with the school of Weber, and not even Weber was able to finish that project. It seems like there is a line of unfinished projects in that kind of an attempt to make this kind of a synthesis.
Definitely. There's one more component to risk, uncertainty, and profit I'd like to raise, and it occurs in the chapters after the ones you've looked at the end. And in those chapters, and by the way, these ideas were not in the dissertation.
Yeah.
So we have taken the dissertation as far as it will take us.
Yeah.
And in the revisions to the dissertation that ended up as the concluding chapters of Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, Knight brings up a couple other ideas. First of all, he introduces the notion of separating the entrepreneur into owner and manager, and so that the return to the profit goes to the owner, who takes the profit, but is actually now not making decisions. And in the modern corporation, Knight argues the owner hires managers to make decisions for them, and now the manager is the person running the show and making the decisions at the technical level, so this in one sense it doesn't challenge the theory of uncertainty and profit and uncertainty. It doesn't challenge them, but it does introduce an additional component, and that is that the question of does the owner, is the manager actually going to do what's best for the owner? Or is the manager going to do what's in their welfare? And so you actually get a nascent kind of public choice theory, but it's not embedded in the public sector. It's embedded in the owner. It's a principal agent problem, right? And for Knight, this notion is part of his interest in the emergence of modern corporations, in which have owners who have nothing to do with the company, and so they're not entrepreneurs, right? So he stops using the word entrepreneur, and he talks about owners and managers, and the entrepreneurial function gets lost, and a different set of agenda kick in, and then he raises a question that obviously the principal agent problem raises often, and that is, can we say that the manager is actually functioning for the betterment of society? The existence of the firm may be better for society, and the sort of entrepreneurship is good for society. But when we separate ownership and management, we end up potentially with, over time, decisions which make the firm function more for private interest, the interests of the managers, or maybe the interests of the owners, but specifically the managers, and not for society. And then right at the very end, he suggests that the same might be said about public bureaucrats.
Right.
So you get this really interesting kind of, in the last chapter, you get this interesting nod towards the kind of the theory of principal agent problems, the theory of the principal agent problem potentially causing issues about the extent to which business decisions are beneficial to society, and then also the public choice problem. Of the bureaucrat and the manager being essentially the same thing, and the bureaucrat functioning supposedly on social benefit, but for their own interest.
There is a couple of interesting things that you're mentioning, and I'll take a shot at trying to connect them, and you can tell me what you think about the rational reconstruction here. But I think that for one, that kind of a criticism of the modern enterprise, of the modern corporation, is something that is very institutionalist in the old sense. It is very critical, and that is really something that would put him in the same really room with Veblen, who made quite a similar argument.
And Gardner Means.
Yeah.
The modern corporation in what
Berlin Means.
Berlin Means, thank you. Yes, Berlin.
So those are two people, Gardner Means and Adolf Berl, I think, who were writing a book on the modern corporation, making this argument that we're not really sure whether this separation of ownership and control is a good thing in the long term, and it seems that this is something that resonates with Knight. But also throughout the talk, you have been mentioning a couple of topics that really you can find in many of the scholars and economists who passed through Chicago in the second half of the 20th century. I think Knight was around until the 60s or the 70s even.
60s, really.
But you mentioned, for instance, the fact that we shouldn't really, he would oppose economic imperialism. He would oppose, in that sense, Lionel Robbins, for instance, but he would also not endorse some of his students like Becker, Gary Becker, for instance. And I think he would resonate much more with people like Ronald Coase, who says, well, economics is about exchanges, and economics is about exchanges in markets, maybe outside markets as well. Maybe economics might be about organization, markets versus firms, but definitely we shouldn't think about this isolated Robinson maximizing on an island. That seems to be one theme that might be Knightian.
Right.
Theme of the new or modern Chicago School of Economics.
Yeah.
I think when you mentioned the principal agent problem, that not only in my mind connects to the modern public choice, but you have many University of Chicago scholars who are talking about really the theory of the firm that goes from Coase, but also then is extended in the issue of team production, principal agent problem within firms, Altian and Demsetz, and that it really is a stream of new institutionalist theory of organization.
Right.
And you can find some of these meta ruminations about that in Knight. So maybe we can wrap up with this, and,
yeah.
and you can maybe tell us something about the environment that Knight found himself in Chicago when he came there. We mentioned institutionalism was still quite strong, and when he left, you have this generation of Chicago School of Economics, prominent, really quite strong economic group of theorists coming up with quite important and quite distinguished theory of prices and understanding microeconomic functioning of markets through that price theory. So maybe the environment that Knight came into and how he transformed and what that environment took from Knight and what it didn't take from Knight, I think that might be an interesting question to look into as a closing theme.
Yeah, it's a great theme, and the book I published on Frank Knight and American economics.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be titled "Why Did the Chicago School Reject Frank Knight?"
Right.
And other essays. And the publisher said, no, that's too interesting a title. It has to be dull and boring, and it has to check off certain boxes for search terms. So, but there is an essay in that book called "Why Did the Chicago School Reject Frank Knight?" And certainly my argument there is that exactly along the lines of what you were just articulating, this tension between the development by his students and indeed his friends of a understanding of market theory that in many ways enhanced our appreciation for the functioning of markets in all kinds of settings, and at the same time did so by a means which, as we've already suggested, fundamentally undermined sort of Knightian themes, and that there were then others who picked up those themes, but perhaps not completely within the Chicago tradition. So you've mentioned Coase. I certainly think Coase and Knight have a lot of resonances. If Knight had ever gotten around to writing more about actual institutions, he probably would have followed his brother, who became an economic historian and taught Doug North.
Yeah.
Those and had some of these same kind of issues. And Knight was always more interested in the theory of institutions than in the study of institutions. And that's a kind of important distinction to remind ourselves when we think about him in connection to institutionalists. But certainly the moves that were made theoretically especially between the 30s and the 70s in Chicago, from his point of view, end up, even though in some ways his teaching contributed to them, they take economics farther away from his kind of ultimate vision of how you do social science than what they did. And I think specifically for the students' benefit of two pieces that if you want to understand what Chicago economics is methodologically. There's two pieces you have to read. You have to read Milton Friedman's 1953 essay, Methodology of Methodology of Positive Economics, which lays out an understanding of economic theory that is still today has a strong place in American economics, at least, and for many years, well into the 1980s, possibly into the 1990s as well. Many graduate programs had incoming graduate students read that essay as sort of, this is the piece you have to read to understand what we're doing. The second piece is really an amendment to that piece, and I've already mentioned it, and it's George Stiegler and Gary Becker's essay De Gustibus Non Est Disputandum. And that's a Latin expression. It is so. It says essentially
we're not supposed to discuss or
there's no discussing or arguing over, no disputing over tastes, right? So when I say I like M&Ms, and you say since Pavel, you're in England, you have Smarties, and you might say I have Smarties, M&Ms. Pretty much the same thing, and I say no, they're not the same thing. I like M&Ms, and it's like, okay. I mean, there's no disputing that, right?
That is trivial. But then, for instance, when you're talking about blood diamonds, right? Well, I don't care that my ring actually contains 10% of labor which has been extracted by force,
right?
And you would say, well, that's your preference. Maybe we do not really admit violations of property rights, so maybe what is out of bounds in terms of crime, but maybe it's not illegal to buy a diamond that has been purified by a set of contracts globally. So I don't really care. You paid money for it. The person sold it to you voluntarily. That's just and you just don't go beyond that. And you might say, well, maybe fair trade coffee. Maybe you want to consider that, because maybe that does something to the people who are actually growing coffee. Or you would say, well, I don't care. I just drink whatever coffee there is.
Right.
And that De Gustibus Non Est Disputandum basically says that's a waste of time. We don't care about
those
that
discussions. That's right. Yeah, Larry Summers wrote that famous World Bank essay letter. Do you know about this?
Yeah.
The reason Larry Summers never became, Larry Summers has been, the chair of almost everything other than the World Bank. And he wrote an essay for the World Bank about suggesting that dumping dirty chemicals in poor nations would actually be good for them. And it got picked up and put into the press. And obviously people were horrified that he would suggest that a country would be benefited from being the dumping ground for chemicals that have long-lasting consequences on human health and environmental conditions.
It strikes me that you can only say something like that when you do not extend your pure theory analysis to the analysis of the ethical and political and institutional dimension. I think if you only stick with the pure economic theory, then you can say something like that, because you can come up with the model that supports that. But that's one part of the story that Knight is urging us to.
You also need a theory of ethics.
Right.
You also need a theory of politics.
Right.
Yeah, and that's so. Yes, that's the context, and so I while Frank Knight definitely strongly influenced the Chicago School of Economics, the Chicago School of Economics has gone a long way away from where Frank Knight would have gone. I was talking with a well-known Chicago economist recently. He's not one of the Nobel Prize winners. He potentially maybe in the future is, but I doubt it. But we were walking across campus and fell into step with each other, and so he asked me who I was, and I said, "Well, are you so and so?" And we started a conversation. He said, "You do work on Frank Knight." He said, "I've just started reading Frank Knight. I disagree with every single thing he says."
He's been disowned.
And I said, I'm not surprised by that.
Yeah.
You don't owe it. I also said, you also, like, just because you're a Chicago economist doesn't mean you owe allegiance to Frank Knight.
Yeah.
But yes.
Well, there is this distinction.
Economics has departed from.
Yeah, there's this
Frank
distinction that some people made between the old and new Chicago School of Economics, and it's questionable where and how it happened. But I think one of these points that I hear you talking about is that the institutionalism of Frank Knight really highlights the limitations of pure theory. And that is one thing that Frank Knight students somehow filtered away and sort of didn't really.
And he may have, he taught pure theory, and so he may have contributed to his ideas.
I think so. I hear that as well a little bit. That also, sort of questioning or diluting or dropping the importance of uncertainty in entrepreneurship could also lead or at least contribute to the idea that you can have the model of perfectly competitive markets with perfect information without profits and without entrepreneurs. And again, that could be his responsibility, but also it's very difficult to make the case that one is really responsible for what other people do with their ideas.
Obviously,
you don't have a patent on these concepts. But also, one last thing that seems to me to be characterizing these two essays that you mentioned, Friedman's essay on positive economics and Stigler and Becker de Gustibus, is that this really is something that McCloskey calls modernist economics, which seems to me that Knight is he's not limited to that. There are some elements of modernism in him, but there is maybe also something that you could call postmodernism in a sense.
Yeah, so, I'd agree. In fact, I often think that that Deirdre is a follower of what I would think of as the good tradition out of Frank Knight.
Right. So we're talking about Deirdre McCloskey. Was she a student of Frank Knight?
No.
That's too late. She's too young for it.
She says I did meet him or was in the room with him. She came to Chicago in, I believe, 1968. Yeah. So he was still alive, but he died in 72.
Right.
And he was pretty much out of academic activity by the late 80s, by the late 60s. So she says, yes, I mean, people said, oh, that's Frank Knight. And she was like, oh, okay. And she says, now I wish I had, made his acquaintance. And, because she is an admirer in the same sense that you and I are, which is both critical and appreciative. Yeah. And her work, there are elements of her work that represent really good versions of the kinds of things he was thinking about.
Well, when I think about his interest in Weber and Verstehen and Weltanschauung, understanding and worldview or cosmovision, as some people call it, when that changes, then your world that you thought you understood really changes radically, and you're in a new world that you have no idea about how it works and where will it lead to.
Right.
And it seems to me that when Deirdre McCloskey talks about the change in understanding of what is virtuous and what is vicious in terms of following self-interest, in terms of making profits, honest profits, that is really something that you can find as a sort of an underlying current in Knight. It definitely connects Knight with Weber. It could potentially connect McCloskey to those people, and that thesis, that ideas and understanding is really important. Is sort of quite difficult to include in the positivist or modernist agenda of economics. It doesn't fit in there. It's too subjective. It's too intangible. It's too metaphysical in a sense. It's storytelling, right? It's not science. That's for novelists. That's art.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are tensions in Knight, definitely in that sense.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He wrote an essay back in 1928 on beauty.
Right.
And later in life on other things like that. His last essay that was never finished was on Adam Smith.
Right. Going back, full circle. I think.
Right.
So I think this is a perfect place where we can stop, where we can finish.
Yeah,
I thank you very much. That was
I've enjoyed it.
That was a great discussion.